Welcome to hand finishing. I've got the camera set up over my homemade vise. This is the one that I use in a couple of other videos. This is nothing more than a piece of mild steel stock with a chunk of leather glued to it. All this is just a support for the blades I'm going to grind, or hand sand, excuse me. Very important, I think. I'll start out showing you one of the main apparatuses I use for hand sanding. This is nothing more than a chunk of aluminum I found in the scrap yard, and what I've done was I've ground it into a triangle cross section. The reason I do this, when I cut my sandpaper, I bought one of those, I call it a guillotine cutter, like you see in the schools and things like that, just a big arm that comes down, chops paper. I use that to cut my sandpaper. As you can see right here, I cut all my sandpaper into strips. Let's see, that's 600. I think that whole pile's 600. Normally what I do on the grinder is I will go to 400 or 600 on the grinder depending on the specific knife. And then from there I come in and I hand finish. What I've got here is a 52-100 Forge 52-100 blade. Something that comes to mind just looking at this, and I think it's worth mentioning. A lot of guys, when they build their knives, they get all wrapped around the axle about a ricasso. They think a ricasso's got to be flat. Well, if you look real closely at this one, especially from this point of view, my ricassos are not flat. All of my knives are basically an elongated diamond. The highest part of that diamond is going to be right in the center of the ricasso. You can actually see a small line here. When I clean up the tapers on these blades, what I do is go on the flat platen, in this manner, grind this side of the blade, grind this side of the blade, then, well, let me back up just a second. I'll grind until it goes past the shoulders on these blades. When I flip over to do the tang side, I'll literally chase that cut up into the middle of the ricasso. Like I said, I want my high spot to be right in the middle of the ricasso. The reason that I do that is it makes assembly of a knife much easier. The more taper you have in this tang, the more severe this taper, the easier it is to fit a guard on, because the guard's going to continue to fit tighter and tighter and tighter as you press it up onto these shoulders. So anyway, I'll get into doing a little hand sanding here. I support the blade with this piece of leather covered steel. Get a chunk of paper. And what I do is line the paper up on the edge of this aluminum sanding stick. And then I just start wrapping it around. The main intent of this originally was to make the sharpened triangles so that I could get into spaces like these plunge cuts and things back here. What I found by wrapping the paper around this is just these multiple wraps of paper give a very slight cushion, and it makes your sandpaper last longer and also makes things easier to get cleaned out, smoothed up, all that sort of thing. And I normally, rather than trying to sand an entire knife blade, that can be somewhat overwhelming. What I try to do is I try to break it down into thirds or fourths, depending on how long the blade is. This particular blade's about 4.5 inches long. So I'll start at the front, clean everything up, and then I'll just kind of start stepping my way, overlapping until I get back in to the plunge cuts. And I won't even worry about the ricasso until I'm completely finished with the blade. This also makes me think a lot of folks get really wrapped around the axle about how this grind line looks. And I suppose that's a personal preference issue. Personally, myself, I don't like grind lines running down blades. That's just me. So when I hand sand, I'm actually blending this entire side of the blade all together. And when I'm done hand sanding, it just all blends in. The big trick about this is to keep looking and looking and looking. And a lot of times you kind of have to rotate your head around in the light, sometimes even change the light. You know, I've got this really, really bright photographic light, sits on an arm light on this side. The other side, I have this particular light, which is a halogen track light. Basically, all I did was take the track light and pulled it off the track and put it on one of these arms. So this gives me a couple of different kind of lights to view things in, and just helps me find the scratches that otherwise a single source of light wouldn't reveal. And the camera may shake a little bit while I'm doing this, simply because I tend to go at it pretty hard. And the good thing about this is when you wear out a side of the paper that you're using, just take and tear it off, toss it aside, start with a fresh chunk. And I tend to kind of rock this stick a little bit back and forth. Not necessarily that I'm tilting it, but just that I'm putting more pressure on one side and another. And what that does is that allows me to catch spots. That, in conjunction with that little bit of padding those multiple turns of paper made. And things like this also reveal little spots like this right here, things that I've missed in the process. But the idea there is just keep going until you get it all out. The way I used to explain this to people was sand until you think you're done, and then sand 10 minutes more. But not only am I tilting side to side on this paper, I can also add pressure one way towards this edge or towards that edge, just to kind of catch things and blend things a little easier. One thing you'll be tempted to do is to come up over this ricasso or over these plunge cuts into the ricasso. Don't do that. Just leave that ricasso alone for right now, and we'll pick it up once the blade's all finished. Here's the whole joy of this sharpened triangle, is I can get up into these plunge cuts and just raise it up and down a little bit. There's probably not going to be much in a plunge cut anyway, if you did it correctly on the grinder, but this just makes your life a little bit easier hand finishing. And again, just kind of keep moving your head around in the light. One of the worst things you could do is miss scratches here, particularly the little ones that I call shadow scratches. Those are scratches that you'll only see if you rotate your body, your head back and forth around in the light, or move this light around a little bit so it shines differently. The reason I'm so adamant about that is that if you miss that scratch here, and this particular blade is going to be etched anyway. This is a differentially heat treated 52-100 blade, so it's going to have a hard edge and a soft back. Should I miss scratches or anything like that, even the what I call the shadow scratches, they just jump out boldly when you etch a blade. So you really have to take your time and just make sure that you get everything out that needs to be out. Probably the one thing I dislike the most is right here. I've got just a little where the edge of the belt cut in, just it's ever so slightly of a groove, but that'll be a massive mistake if I don't get it out. See that? That's how fine I finish my knives down before I even come over here. The edge on this blade's already sharp. Okay, I'm going to back this out just a little bit, clamp it back down. Now we can get to the ricasso. And visually you can see the line where the two flats of a blade on this blade meet. Once I get done hand sanding this, that's all going to blend together, and unless you're using a micrometer, you'll never know it's there. And we're getting there little by little. Down here and work on that a little more. Again, pay very close attention and rotate your visual perspective in the light so you can tell if you've gotten all the scratches out. And we got that looking pretty good. Now this is where your personal preference is going to come into play at this point. Sometimes I do stop at 600 grit and do my etches after the 600 grit. What I have found over the years that if you do go ahead and go to 600 or even 1200 grit, of course you've got a lot more work on your hands, but also the etch comes out, for lack of a better term, much more crisp. A lot of times with 600 grit, if you're not really careful, you'll actually be able to see the little scratch lines once you've etched your blades. So that's basic hand finishing 101. Probably the only other things to tell you about, I will not hand sand the spine. The reason being is that once my knives are all together, what I do is I radius the spines, simply because someplace to put the thumb without a sharp corner if you're going to use the knife and press in with it and things like that. The one part that a lot of guys forget is don't forget the bottom of this ricasso. Get in here and clean this up just as well as you would the blade. As they say, the devil's in the details, and quite frankly, when it comes to building and finishing out custom knives, the more attention you pay to detail, the better your product's going to be. So I'm going to wrap this one up for now and move on to the next step.